Chapter 16. 14 years back. Rosanna met the Dryad's eyes with a smile. Whatever the Dryad felt about the sailor, she trusted and loved Rosanna, and it came to Claire that Mr. Kirk need not bother about winning his niece. Rosanna would win her for him. Rosanna was sitting the farthest back in the shade of the rose bush, one shoulder supported slightly by an end of Granny's own garden bench. She was wearing one of her sky-blue smocks, and her hair, even in the shade, gleamed its delicious buttercup gold. Her expression was one of tranquil aliveness, and it was to Rosanna that Mr. Kirk seemed to tell his story, although Rosanna was the only one present who already knew it. Perhaps he too, like Claire, felt that Rosanna must help him with the elusive Dryad and the skeptical Pat if things were to come out happily. Well, my scene opens on a ship, an ocean liner, 14 years back. I was 18 then, and returning from my first adventure. I had left college with scant warning to my sister Margaret, who was helping put me through. She and I were the last of our family, but she was married and had 2 children, and I did not feel that in starting off on my own I was treating her badly. All the same, in a sense, I was running away from her and her influence, for she had her heart set on my having a college education, and she was using up our little joint capital to secure it. But I was no scholar, although Margaret couldn't see it, and I did have a sea longing. I managed to get an assistant to a steward job on a big liner sailing for Buenos Aires. That wasn't being precisely a sailor, but it was going to sea at any rate. Going out was even more fun than I had hoped or imagined, in spite of the hard work. But coming back it was another story. Then I was a heartsick boy, because a cable had weighted our ship in Rio with the news that my sister and my brother-in-law had both died of influenza while I was at sea. A neighbor was mothering the 2 children until I should appear, and something could be arranged. Those children, of course, were these young folks here, Pat and Margaret. Uncle Lawrence was a passenger on the boat, and my work took me into his cabin frequently. His name was not Titus then, however, it was Vale. Well, to that man, Vale, who from the first egged me on to it, I have realized since. I poured out my life's history. Grief and worry had softened my hard, youthful spirit, and made me turn for sympathy anywhere I could imagine its possibility. Before I was done, names, dates, places, all things concerning those motherless children and their father and mother, as well as myself, were familiar to the sympathetic gentleman. Then, midway of that nightmare voyage, I fell sick of influenza myself. Isolation, unconsciousness, delirium. I was reported dead, or as good as dead, I imagine. Uncle Lawrence must have believed, at any rate, that I was ended, and he considered that luck had played into his hands. I will tell you why. Uncle Lawrence is, as he admits, in this morning's note to me, an adventurer, a fellow who gets his living where he need give the least in return for it. Some years before, I met up with him. He had, for his own purposes, married a princess of Hydor. Hydor is, Pat and Margaret know very well, an almost independent country in India. They know, too, that the ruling family, called Maharajas of Hydor, are Mohammedans, and that there are several wives for each king, and often complicated branches, or lines of descent. The branch Uncle Lawrence's girl princess belonged to was and is at daggers drawn with the party in power. The princess was, in fact, a frightened, lost refugee from Hydor at the time Uncle Lawrence married her. What his game there was, I don't pretend to fathom, and it doesn't matter to us. All I know is what the world knows, that one day, a few years after the strange marriage, she was shot dead in a street in Rome. It has never been proved, but it is believed in Hydor that she was assassinated by order of the reigning Maharaja. Are you following? Mr. Kirk had been talking fast, but clearly, his watch in his hand, his eyes almost certainly on Rosanna, as though he counted on her believing whatever anyone else thought. But now he glanced around his circle and found that the audience was all his rapt. He saw wide eyes, intent faces, and clasped hands. Even the rose bush seemed stilled to listen in the hot sunlight, and Granny's garden wall. Granny was maybe listening too. Claire thought she must be. The heat had become rather intense, but it was exhilarating, not wilting, as heat can be exhilarating when minds are wide awake in it. The sailor continued, "Well, bad luck for that Maharaja. There was a strong and extremely well-organized secret party opposed to his cruel though canny rule. All they needed was a pretender of the blood royal to fight him with, but he was perfectly aware of this, and he had seen to it that no such possible pretender was left. Uncle Lawrence's wife, that poor princess, was the last possible pretender to die. But by killing her, if indeed he did kill her, the Maharaja had called rather pointed attention to her existence, and to her marriage, which had been overlooked until then, or forgotten by the party in opposition. In fact, it supplied them with an idea, had that, until this minute, lost and ignored princess, a son by her marriage with a foreigner. They told one another that an heir of Hydor, who was half white, might get for their party the sympathy of the British, who had small use for the Maharaja. Straightway, this underground party, who were enormously rich, and could count on popular support, if only they could produce an heir, set out to look up that hypothetical son. It was a difficult search, for Uncle Lawrence's name had changed once or twice since his princess's death, and his life during the years of marriage had been so obscure, and its events so carefully guarded by himself, that tracking down facts about him proved impossible. But the trackers in the end found their man, and as it happened found him, as he was walking up the gangplank of our liner a few minutes before sailing. They managed to board to, and at some time or other, soon it is to be supposed, they approached him with the vital question, had the princess before her death given birth to a son? Uncle Lawrence, we may allow ourselves to admire his wits, if not the uses he puts them to, surmised that, with these men so eager about it, there might be some advantage in replying yes, so he immediately became certain that he had a son, a fine son. The men from Hydor, in their hope and joy, were indiscreet. Where, oh where, was the little prince? In America. Yes, and Uncle Lawrence was even at that minute returning to him after a year's absence, hungry for the sight of his darling little boy. The men from Hydor were completely taken in, for Uncle Lawrence plays the sentimental role to perfection when it is required. Straightway they opened their hearts to him and spread forth their plans. We will go with you, they said, and never leave you again until we have seen that boy. For that little son of yours has a great destiny. One day he will be Maharaja of Hydor. Uncle Lawrence was quick to fall in with their designs. It was at once agreed that Ali, the elder of the men, was to stay with the boy always, as mentor and tutor, but secretly so far as the outside world was concerned. The Mussulman was ready to sacrifice the next 15 years of his life to training his king, so that when the time came to bring the youth forward as pretender, he should be prepared and worthy. But the whole thing must be kept very much in the dark, because if the reigning Maharaja should become aware of what Ali was doing abroad, the little boy and Ali himself would soon die, mysteriously and swiftly, no matter where they were on the globe, to the end that the Maharaja should remain in ignorance. It was to be reported in Hydor that Ali had died. Further, to cover their tracks, Uncle Lawrence agreed to change his name again, and to bring the prince up as his nephew, not his son. The boy was to have the advantage of living in many countries, learning many languages, and being nurtured by one of India's philosophers and scholars, for such was Ali, son of Yusuf. And the revenue which was to make all this possible, and allow Uncle Lawrence to feel repaid for the inconveniences attending the situation, was so great that it must have staggered even that audacious adventurer. All that remained for him then was to lay hands on a little boy of the appropriate age, promptly on landing, and straightway I appeared in his cabin, and while I changed his towels and spread up his bed, he first heard of my orphaned niece and nephew. He drew out all the facts, and must have been on the point of offering me a share in the adventure and enterprise which was so occupying his mind, when I fell so desperately and conveniently ill. Probably the ship's doctor represented me to him as good as dead before the landing in New York, but whether I was actually dead or only very ill did not matter much. Uncle Lawrence was accustomed to acting quickly, and this situation was a comparatively simple one for him. He had only to break the news to Ali that there was a little girl, as well as a little boy, hire a car at the dock, drive the 50 miles to the university town, where the children were in the care of a neighbor, who, he was aware, had never seen me pass himself off as myself, act his perfected sentimental role, take the children bag and baggage, and whisk away. It was all done with such superb acting and swift sureness that my sister's friend had only time to be grateful that Uncle Jim was apparently prosperous as well as devoted. She gave the children to him without a murmur. And then the self-styled uncle, the 2 kidnapped children, and the gentleman from Hydor vanished, all to reappear in America at Wingate only 3 weeks or so ago. And now I will show you a picture of your mother, Pat and Margaret. I have a big framed photograph at the inn, which I meant to get Sunday, but I have not been back to the inn since breakfasting here, as you know, so this will have to do for now. Mr. Kirk held his open watch out toward the Dryad. She took it shyly, but became instantly absorbed, her face bent down to it. Enameled on the inside of the case, a face looked up at hers, a face that might almost have been a reflection of her own. The likeness was one of those rare tricks of nature. Mother and daughter had not only the same features, but the same expression, an expression of delicate aloofness and inner loveliness. The Dryad made no sound. She only looked and looked, and then Pat's cheek came against hers, and he was looking too. "Why, it's you, Dora," he cried, and then suddenly he looked up at the sailor, with his blue eyes, so like his uncle's, so unlike the dark eyes of his mother, and said, "I mean Margaret. I beg your pardon, sir." The boy and the sailor held each other's gaze, and as the seconds passed, Claire realized that they were greeting each other for the first time, accepting each other, finding each other. But the Dryad's eyes would not lift. They were kept on the dear, dark eyes of a mother, of her own mother. Her face was drained of every bit of color, and the fingers, so delicately curled about the thin gold watch, were shaking. Rosanna leaned forward and urged, "Please, Mr. Kirk, go on. Tell them the rest. It will make them understand." "Well, it's quickly told. Pat seems to understand and believe already, though. But I'll finish up. Listen." Claire was looking at the Dryad, fascinated by her expression of tenderness as she bent above the watch. And now, when Mr. Kirk said, "Listen," and was about to finish his story, the Dryad lifted her eyes, but not to him. Her glance fell on the open doorway into the dining room, and Claire watched the color come slowly back into her face before she realized that the Dryad was smiling at someone there in the doorway. Claire turned her own head just a bit and saw what the Dryad saw. It was the Hindu, or rather the Muslim man, Ali. He was sitting on the top step in the white sunlight. His headdress and white robes blended so with the heat and light that Claire had to focus her glance a second time before she was certain that she was seeing what she thought she saw. when she was sure of the hawk-like face, the burning and quiet dark eyes, and the whole presence of the man, she could not understand it. How had he come there like that, and nobody noticed? Was only the Dryad aware of him? How quiet and unstartled the Dryad's smile for him had been! Probably she was accustomed to these sudden, almost magical appearances of the tutor. Was he magic? Had he simply materialized himself out of the white sunlight here in Granny's enclosed garden? Ollie was aware that Claire was aware, and she felt that his mind was speaking to her mind. It seemed to say, "Stay tranquil. All is well. Do not disturb the peace. I do not disturb the peace. Listen to Mr. Kirk's story." And then Claire knew that she had been listening to Mr. Kirk, even while she listened to Ali's mind. The words he had been saying sounded now like an echo in the front of her head, so she had not missed them. They were, "Well, I recovered, after some weeks of physical and mental torment, and the minute I was let out of the hospital, I started for the college town where my brother-in-law had taught Greek, and where I supposed my nephew and niece were being kept in expectation of my coming. But of course it was no such thing. An uncle, some uncle or other, had already claimed them. Chapter 17. Explanations finished. "It took me a day or two," Mr. Kirk went on, "to prove to the authorities and the kind neighbor my relationship with those vanished children, and to set a search on foot for the kidnapper. I was certain of one thing from the neighbor's description. The fake uncle was Mr. Vale, my acquaintance of shipboard, but his motives I couldn't imagine. In my grief for my dead sister, the loss of her children from my life was magnified to an extent. Again the sailor had turned to Rosanna. Her look was all of pity and understanding. "Well, no matter. Needless to say, inside of a month I had used up all that my college education had left of my small capital in a vain search. And then I went to sea again, this time as a sailor, before the mast, on a real sailing vessel, carrying coal to the West Indies. For 2 years I was sailing with one ship or another, knocking around the globe, but failing to advance my fortunes, because I never stayed long enough with one captain to prove myself capable. I was restless, and always on the watch for my niece and nephew, or rather for Mr. Vale, who could be my only clue to them. They, of course, would by now be grown out of all recognition. And then, at the end of that 2 years, the only melancholy years of my life, I was lucky. We were docked at Cherbourg, and I, along with a few other sailors, was given 3 days for Paris. On a crowded street there I saw Mr. Vale himself getting into a big closed car. The car was off before I could hail it or him, so I hired another craft, a rickety taxi, and followed as fast as I could. When we reached the destination of the big car, I had spent on that taxi every sou I had in my pocket, or in fact owned in the world. Vale had entered his residence, and the iron gates of his drive had been relocked before we docked at the curb. It was a sumptuous villa, a palace, I thought it, in one of the most beautiful suburbs of Paris. I dismissed my taxi, giving the driver my sailor's scarf for his tip, and drew near the closed and locked gates. I looked at lawns, flower gardens, fountains. I realized opulence and even grandeur. And then my heart started up a tom-tom, for beyond the farthest garden, not far from the front entrance to the house, 2 small children were playing around the basin of a marble fountain. One was a girl, the other a chubby fat baby. Could I doubt that they were Margaret and Pat? Suddenly, almost as though they had heard that tom-tom of my heart beats, and were attracted to the commotion, they started running down the lawn toward the gate where I leaned, the cold bars pressed into my palms. As they struck the gravel drive, the baby stumbled and pitched forward onto his nose. Margaret somersaulted over him. In an instant both were up again and weeping, embracing each other, cheek against cheek. And then I called, wildly perhaps, "Margaret, Pat." The next I knew, an ugly old woman appeared, as though by magic sprung from the ground, a veritable witch, but a witch in a nurse's blue garb and fluttering cap strings. She bore down upon the weeping children, gave me one murderous look, and, spreading her blue cape like a wing, spirited the babies, quite concealed beneath it, away to the villa and inside. Then I rang the bell at the gate. I rang it loud and long. Soon a man in livery came out of a little house there, and tried to send me away. To my demands for an interview with Mr. Vale, he replied that he had never heard of Monsieur Vale, that the master of the villa was Monsieur Lawrence Titus, and the 2 children I had seen were Isadora Titus and Norman, his niece and nephew. But for all the fellow's assurance, I did somehow prevail upon him to take a note to the uncle of those children, whatever his name. I scrawled it on a dirty piece of paper, which I picked up from the gutter for the purpose. He returned almost before he had gone. Monsieur Titus considered me a lunatic. The name James Kirk meant nothing to him whatever. If I did not go away from the gate immediately, the police were to be summoned. I moved along out of sight of the villa, and sat down in a little park to think. When I arose from that meditation, my way was clear to me. I must go back to the ship and start my life, as though it were just beginning in earnest. Margaret's children were well dressed, well fed, and carefully tended, and I without a sou in my pocket. A rough sailor, even if the fake uncle gave up his children to me, what could I do with them, or for them? How could all my love for their mother, and for themselves, supply them with food, and clothes, and education? It was obvious to me now that I must go away and never make my claim. By rights the children seemed to belong to the man who cherished them. So I got back to my ship and to the sea. But the sea never washed away, and the salt winds never blew away my blood yearning for my own, for Margaret's children. Years later, when my first novel was making its little stir, I went back to that villa and found it in the hands of people who had never heard of Monsieur Titus. So that chapter ended. By now, both Hester and Rob had become aware of Ali on the steps in the sunlight, but his mind must have spoken to their minds as it spoke to Claire's. They looked at him with some wonder, perhaps breathed a bit faster for a second or two, and then regained their tranquility and their interest in Mr. Kirke's story. Claire noticed something in Ali's hand that was whiter than the sunlight, and that seemed somehow an overtone to the heat and light, as Ali himself seemed an overtone. It was the circlet of diamonds, the Dryad's bracelet. How had he come by it? He must have picked it up in the parlor. So he had not just materialized here in the garden by some method of magic. He had come walking through their house and taken his seat on the step while everyone was absorbed by Mr. Kirke's story, exactly as any ordinary person might. He was no apparition. He was real. But Rosanna and Mr. Kirke, and perhaps Pat, were still unaware of him. Pat's whole attitude toward Claire that he was lost to anything going on there but the story. He looked stirred and solemn. And now let's jump altogether, a long jump, to just a few months ago, Mr. Kirke went on. Last January I was in Aden, Arabia, digging out some local color for my new book. I had caught on to a little Arabic, but needed a lot more, when by chance, but I doubt that anything is chance in this, our world, I encountered a gentleman from Hydor, a friendly sort of Mussulman, who was pleased to exchange long hours of conversation in the language of the Koran, for brief whiffs of English. That was how it happened that guardedly and as fiction he told me of an American boy who was being educated by an Indian scholar in Europe, one day to come forward as pretender and king of Hydor. Gradually, day by day, he enlarged upon this topic, and at last, accidentally, he let the name of the pretender slip. It was Norman Titus. As lightning illuminates the sea at night, my mind was illuminated by that name. I understood in a flash Mr. Vale's motives. The picture was vivid and complete. I knew that this story, which so obsessed the mind of my teacher, was no fiction but fact, and that the future king he longed for was nobody but my own Irish-American nephew. I never went back for another lesson. No use in that. The man was keen enough to have caught my awakening, and to close up, clam-wise. No hope of getting help from him in locating Norman Titus. In fact, it was hardly safe to remain in Arabia with this man's knowledge of his own irreparable indiscretion on his conscience. I myself, for the first, and I hope the last time in my life, turned a vanishing trick. Disguised, I got out of the country. It took months, as you see, but this spring the hunt got me as far as the Italian woman who had lately taught embroidery arts to Margaret. From her I learned the way of life of the Titus household, and the health and well-being of my relatives. I came from Italy straight to Four Corners, Massachusetts, New England, arriving too late to call at Wingate on the night of my arrival, but wasting no time about it the next morning. This time I sent in no dirty bit of paper to Uncle, but a properly engraved calling card. He promptly came to the drawing room, where I was waiting, and he was looking peculiarly green, to my delight. But he had all his nerve in readiness. A man like that can't afford to lose it, you know. Rob and Claire had drawn close to each other at this point. That meeting had taken place in the drawing-room at Wingate, their drawing-room, in the presence of the boy angel. Had he opened his dusty eyes at it? Had the still life lost its stillness at this situation? It was an exciting drama, and had to happen, but oh, why must it take place in that charmed room, the room of their imagination? They were missing some of Mr. Kirke's story. They must listen again. Lies, lies, lies. His niece was ill, could see no one. His nephew was visiting relatives in the West. He had never gone by the name of Vale. I was crazy. At least I must see that I must bring forward some proof of the wild charges I was making. I couldn't just say that his niece and nephew were my niece and nephew, and walk off with 'em, could I? But I had already faced all this. I told Uncle that proof of my relationship with the children might very well wait, but that an interview with their tutor, Ali, would finish his own career like a bomb, I said. A firm of detectives have been working on your history lately, and I have papers at the inn which will prove interesting to Ali, son of Yusuf. Well, that was effective. This time his nerve was withered a bit, but he revived, and the end of much talk was this. I was to go back to my inn for breakfast, giving Uncle time to think over a proposition I had made to him. He had really done well by you children, and he had probably thought me dead, at least until that day when I turned up, a tramp, in Paris. I had no wish to imperil his life by unmasking him to Ali, and no interest whatever in Hydur intrigues. All I was really after was my niece and nephew. He now told me what he thought was the truth about them, that Pat had run away, and that Margaret was locked in her room because of insubordination, under the guard of Ali. But given time, he could manage, he believed, to free Margaret, without Ali's being aware, and deliver her to me at a place of appointment in the woods of the estate. I myself could then take up the search for Pat. As for Ali and the Hydors, they would think that Margaret had run away as Pat had, and Titus would pretend to help them in a search. When the search proved useless, his relationship with the intriguers could end peacefully. If they ever suspect me of imposing on them, he said, my days are done. They'll find me out wherever I am. I thought that too, so I agreed to the slight delay giving him a chance to procure Margaret for me. But when, after breakfasting here with you at Lark's Nest, I returned, Uncle Lawrence proved a little more of an adventurer than I had bargained on. He, Hester interrupted. During Mr. Kirk's narrative, she had finished darning a pair of really disreputable stockings, and now, as she rolled them up and shoved them down into the basket at her elbow, she snapped out, in plain words, that man proved himself a murderer, throwing you into that pit and tying you up and leaving you. He thought you'd starve, for nobody ever goes there, and he'd make some excuse to Ali, and the whole family'd move away. What did you have to go back for? You knew the Dryad and Pat was here safe enough. Mr. Kirk appeared properly humbled. "You're dead right, Hester," he said. "All I wanted of him by that time was that he should return to Lark's Nest with me and himself, tell Pat and Margaret, who were probably spoiled youngsters with lofty ideas of their own importance, that I was their only real uncle, and I thought we might need his help in jolting Margaret's memory. If he wouldn't agree to come, I meant still to hold the threat of informing Ali over him. But I was foolish, just as you say. I ought to have known he was desperate." Hester drew the string tight in the top of her mending bag and got up. "I'll wager it's 10 minutes past noon, or more, and there's still that meetin' over the wall. We are all goin' with you, of course, Mr. Kirk. Leastwise, I am. This time there's to be witnesses, and no nonsense. I want to tell you, though," Mr. Kirk put in quickly, not relishing Hester's superior tone, "that he knocked me into the pit as we were walking and talking, and I had no idea of any drop there at all. I lost consciousness when I hit. I suppose otherwise he never could have tied me up like that. Not in a fair fight, that is." He began to haul in his legs in preparation for rising. "There's that revolver. We'd better take it," he added. And then, when he was up and turned around, halfway toward the door, he caught sight of Ali. "I say," he ejaculated, "how long have you been there?" The others came to their feet too, and Ali also stood up, towering above them all. He replied to Mr. Kirk's astounded question in a voice which thrilled Claire. It was so low and quiet, and at the same time strong. "I have been here, Mr. Kirk, long enough to hear most of your story. It was of profound interest to me, as you may suppose. One thing I would know of you, the name of that traitor who taught you Arabic in Aden, but that you will never tell, I am aware. As for your appointment beyond the wall, there is no necessity to inconvenience yourselves. Mr. Titus is far away, not worrying about it in the least." Mr. Kirk reached an arm and supported himself against the house, looking suddenly ill again. "You have killed him," he cried. Ollie's expression did not change at the accusation. He merely replied calmly, "No, I gave him the big car, full of gasoline, and allowed him to go. Why should I kill? You have strange ideas of me, perhaps because my skin is dark." Hester spoke. She was nearest to Ali, studying him with acute attention. "So you knew all along, even before you heard Mr. Kirk's story, that Uncle Lawrence was a sham?" "Certainly. He had betrayed himself lately with his treatment of Isadora." "Does a man detest his own daughter?" And Titus begrudged Isadora, the very air she breathed, I felt, but it was that volume of the Iliad that persuaded me finally. The day Norman ran away, I happened to ask Mr. Titus about that servant named Patrick Donovan, who had left behind such a beautiful volume. In his face I read confusion. It fitted with results of inquiries I had recently made in the town where we had gone for those children 14 years ago, and that night I noticed that the book was gone from its place in the children's sitting room. I knew where Norman was all the time, of course. It was my business to know. And Isadora I sent here to Lark's Nest, but things have come out better for them than I had hoped. Now there remains only the necessity of saying farewell." But Mr. Kirk advanced upon Ali, his hands clenched. "You sent Margaret to Lark's Nest. And did you will that she should fall and lose her memory? Did you consider that convenient? Did you use your uncanny Eastern powers for that?" Ali paid no attention to the clenched fist. He inquired calmly, "What powers are those? And why should I use power so evilly, even if I possessed it?" Mr. Kirk drew back and shrugged. "Of course we shall never know. But I wouldn't put it past you." "Well, say your farewells then. How did you get here into the garden?" Margaret had come close to Ali while Mr. Kirk spoke, and he put a hand on her shoulder. Claire could not see the Dryad's eyes, but she believed that they were full of tears. Chapter 18. The Proposal. Ali said to the Dryad, "Child, aren't you careless with these precious jewels? They were lying around in that house for anybody to take. These are some of the most beautiful diamonds in the world. I gave them to a princess of Hydor on her birthday. Now that there is no princess, they return to me, but I give them to you, Margaret Donovan. You will find a purchaser for them, and I shall have no further anxiety for your practical welfare." Mr. Kirk burst forth before the Dryad could speak, if indeed she could have spoken at that minute. "Not a bit of it. My niece wants none of such gifts. I intended to return it to you when she brought it in, this morning. We are quite done with Hydor jewels, and intrigues, and young ladies shut up on bread and water by the week. Give it back, Margaret." The Dryad had slipped the circlet over her hand, and Mr. Kirk, as he spoke, made a movement to take it off, but Ali stopped him with a dignified gesture. "Do not think of it as a fortune, then, Mr. Kirk," he said. "Think of it as a keepsake from a teacher to a pupil whom he respects and would have remember him." Mr. Kirk was in a position to see the Dryad's tears now. He softened. "Oh, all right," he agreed. "But that's all it can ever be, a keepsake. Its great money value must never, never touch her life. I don't like the thing." He shuddered. Ali gazed at the belligerent real uncle of his erstwhile charges with half unwilling appreciation. "You have a wisdom after all," he murmured. "If my pupil is led by your thought, the thought I see in you, it may be as well for her as though she were in fact a princess of the royal blood. But such thought here, in the West, is it possible?" It was Hester who commented on that aspiration of a hemisphere, and her comment was merely the monosyllable "ha." Ali's farewell to the group, which followed, was dignified and short, but for Pat there was one long kind look. The Dryad went with him across the fields to the break in the wall of Tanglewood. Claire, standing out in the side yard, watched them walking slowly through the white clarity of the hot, still noon. She knew the Dryad was deeply sad at the parting with the tutor, and that however much Ali had repressed her and disciplined her in the past, she loved him and would always love him. So when the Dryad returned alone, Claire, with a full and understanding heart, was waiting for her at the edge of the lawn. The Dryad appeared more unearthly than ever, strange and fairy, as she came from that leave-taking, in spite of the fact that Rosanna would now believe that everything about her was explained. The circlet of diamonds sparkling on her arm was magic too, to Claire, mysterious in its many-colored radiance. Plans for the future of the new family, for that is what Pat, Margaret, and Mr. Kirk now constituted. A family were rapidly and easily made. Pat wanted to stay on as hired man at Lark's Nest for the present. He had worked with his head all his young life, and now he felt a revulsion against all that and meant to learn what his hands were good for. His uncle heartily approved. "If Rosanna will keep you on," he agreed. "Only, Pat, you will have to stick to business, you know, and not go gadding off in the woods when there is lettuce to weed." "Oh yes, I'll work in dead earnest now, and I may keep my room in the top of the barn." Rosanna invited Margaret to stay with them, a guest in Lark's Nest, for the rest of the summer. "There's so much we can show you," she explained. "Now that you are to be an American girl, it will give you a start to play with us a while. You can learn to drive Pegaway and to take country walks without tripping over tree trunks. We'll go to Crescent Lake, too, and play tennis and swim. Sometimes we'll even take our hired boy. And then we've got to get you a wardrobe. It'll be fun to make some of the things ourselves, don't you think? More fun than making lace." Mr. Kirk accepted this invitation for his niece only after persuasion, but it was so eminently the sensible next move in the Dryad's education that his hesitancy was only due to his consideration for Rosanna. "And I," he decided, "shall keep my room at the inn and finish up the book that has been needing the last third of itself for months, while I figure out where and in what manner we three, Margaret and Pat and I, are to start a home and begin to be a proper family. For a day or so, Violet and Bill Janus left the Fays strictly alone, because they had felt a little snubbed on that last morning call. Something in Hester's eye had told them that she had the authority of Rosanna behind her when she brusquely turned them from the door. They decided between themselves that the country club life at Crescent Lake, with all its dancing and swimming and golf and tennis, was amusement sufficient for them. There was no need to go chasing over to Lark's Nest, where it was really so dull and absolutely unexciting. If Rosanna and Rob wanted society, they would have to do some of the chasing themselves. But the third day Violet wavered. She suddenly said, "I almost think we might put our pride in our pocket, Bill, for Rosanna's sake. She's really too amusing in her quiet way to be wasted out there on the desert air. Haven't you noticed how a party is different when she's in it? Her music and all. I do think we need her." Bill was not deceived by his younger sister's emphasis on Rosanna's music and social talents. He knew well enough that it was Rob she really missed. He was so evenly matched with her at tennis that she found it rather tame playing with other boys after him. She beat them too easily, and Rob could dance, when he would dance perfectly satisfactorily. So Bill answered with a twinkle in his eye at Violet's expense, "I think you may be right, and I'd like to see old Rob again too. Why, it seems years since that last tennis set we had with the Fays. I'm ready to drive over now and see what's doing." When the blue of Crescent Lake had been left behind, and they were spinning along the state road in the new roadster toward Lark's Nest, Violet urged, "Do step on it, Bill. It's nearly 10, and they might be planning a noon picnic or something." It was a perfect morning. Rosanna, in fact, was thinking it was almost too heartbreakingly perfect. It was a day she wanted to hold to her breast hard, hold it fast, and never, never let it go. The air was not air, it was life itself. The fields, in their harmony of color, Devil's Paintbrush, Queen Anne's Lace, Black-Eyed Susans, and Buttercups, made a music almost audible, and there was a breeze that lifted everything into the atmosphere, leaves, clouds, hearts. Lark's Nest itself took on the aspect of a bark afloat on seas of color and light that needed only to unfold winged sails to go sailing away into space with the gay hearts housed there. And the morning caller, Mr. Kirk, it was precisely the morning to crowd into Pegaway and gallop away up Kinderhook Valley to a certain hill pasture where the Fays promised there would be windy shade and a view of circling mountains. It should be a picnic. So it happened that as the roadster from Crescent Lake turned the corner which gave the occupants their first view of the lane, Pegaway had just pranced out of it and was off in the direction of Four Corners. Heavens, it's full. Who were they all? Violet asked, tense with curiosity. Don't know, Bill replied, a little sulkily. He had slowed down a bit. There was a man in front driving with Rosanna and another girl. Rob and Claire and a boy I never saw were in the back. Quite a party. Well, let's catch up with them anyway, Violet begged. We've just got to know. So in spite of Mr. Kirk's dashing driving, it was scarcely a minute later that the high-powered roadster from Crescent Lake overtook Pegaway and with a gay song from its musical horn, shot around and past. The Janices, Rob shouted above Pegaway's racket. What do you bet they wait for us ahead somewhere? If they do, Rosanna called toward the back seat, I say we invite them on our picnic. We haven't been near Crescent Lake in days, and they are always trying to be nice to us. There's plenty of lunch. Claire groaned. Mr. Kirk looked doubtful, and Rob called to him, Jim, save us. Don't let her be hospitable. We don't want 'em. Jim. Mr. Kirk had become Jim to them all by this time, allowed Pegaway to slow to a standstill. Who was the chap driving? He asked. Mr. William Janis, one of Rosanna's most ever-present beaux. Rob replied with malice. To his and Claire's surprise, Rosanna did not protest. She only blushed, and as much of her profile as they could see looked demurely pleased. But Mr. Kirk was not pleased. He gave Rosanna a long look, taking in her blush and the complacent tilt at the corners of her mouth. Then he said crossly, Rosanna, don't be a minx. It isn't like you. Have your own way, if you like, and invite all the young men in the world to our picnic. Spoil it and everything. I'll share my last sandwich with them and 2/3 of the view, if Rob and Claire cried. Don't humor her, Jim. We don't want 'em. Mr. Kirk reached out and turned off his engine. There's a condition attached, he explained, in a lower voice, now that Pegaway was silenced. I'll agree to anything if. He had begun lightly, but now everybody could see that Mr. Kirk was in dead earnest. His voice came out of his throat, rather hard and dry, as though he needed a glass of water perhaps. Claire looked all around them hopefully. No, there wasn't a spring anywhere near. She knew these meadows perfectly. The nearest drink she could get for Mr. Kirk would be from the well of a farmhouse, quite half a mile along. But he was managing without his glass of water. After all, he was saying, We'll let you spoil our picnic, and be as hospitable and social as ever you like. Rosanna, if only you'll become engaged to me first, here and now. Such a thing to happen to Rosanna. Rosanna the reserved. Rosanna the dignified. A proposal in front of them all, even Pegaway, in broad daylight. Ha! Rob ejaculated softly. You'll have to hurry, Rosanna. They're coming back. Say no. Then Jim will be on our side. Rosanna turned on Rob, furious. She was truly angry. You're horrid, she cried. You and Claire are both horrid snobs. They are to be invited. And Jim, you knew I was going to marry you. It wasn't fair. The next instant, everybody was singing out. Hello! The roadster had drawn up by Pegaway out at the side of the road. It made the way safe for traffic, of course, but it was death to numberless flowers. That was just like the Janices, just like all that bunch at Crescent Lake. However, Claire and Rob were too excited over the recent proposal of marriage and its acceptance to mind much. Rosanna at once introduced the Dryad, Mr. Kirk, and the hired boy. "So it's you at last," Violet cried, dimpling at Mr. Kirk and holding out a cordial hand. "Mother's been trying to get in touch with you for days. At the inn. They never know where you are. We hadn't heard anything at all about a niece and nephew. How exciting!" She was looking curiously at the Dryad and Pat. The Dryad, in spite of her borrowed clothes, a blue smock of Rosanna's, and a corduroy skirt and sneakers of Claire's, looked somehow too fragile and, yes, too haughty to belong to the carefree crowd in Pegaway, and certainly one never would have guessed her a relation of the blue-eyed, sunburned sailor. Violet turned back to the sailor. "Oh, Mr. Kirk, I do love your books," she babbled on. "Are you going to let Mother give a party for you? How long have you known the Fays? How'd they get hold of you ahead of us? It's too wonderful having a celebrity around. I stayed up almost all night over that story you put in the South Seas. Mother thinks it's—" Rosanna interrupted. She looked like anything but a minx now. She was her kind, candid self. She said, "We've got loads of lunch, thanks to Hester, and we're going to Star Hill. Come along with us, do, and it'll be a real picnic." But then Rosanna, in spite of her natural kindness, took her revenge on all in Pegaway. She added, "Let's change around. I'll go with Bill and Violet, you take my place. Margaret can come along with us in the roadster. It's a dreadfully wide front seat." As she slid from her place and Violet popped into it, Rosanna's glance dared those left behind not to be cordial. And they did not fail Rosanna, for they felt that the day had suddenly turned into her day. But it had been so from the very dawning of it, if they had only known. Chapter 19. Smile of the Angel. The afternoon following that picnic, when James Kirk had been so entertainingly amusing, and Rosanna so airily gay, and the Janices for once had felt in perfect sympathy with those unaccountable Fays, something even more wonderful happened. Claire and Rob and Margaret and Pat were over in Tanglewood, pulling down and hiding the no trespassing signs there. James Kirk had sent a long wire to Senator Lovell, the owner of Wing Gate, asking for permission. Since Mr. Titus had abandoned the place, no difficulty had been made. Claire and Rob, some time back, had got separated from Margaret and Pat. Now, as Claire tucked the torn remains of a white placard which read, "Beware of the dogs," far back into the hollow of an old tree, she said thoughtfully, "Don't you feel how grateful the woods are to us?" "I do. Now the Dryads and the fairies will be coming back. Everything that belonged to Tanglewood before that disgusting Mr. Titus spoiled it will return. Real mystery will come again, not mysteries of footprints and dark-skinned foreigners and such things, but real, untouchable mysteries. Don't you think so?" "Yes," Rob agreed, but Claire was surprised by a fleeting worry in his face. She understood, though, when he added, "But our Dryad must not be a mystery. We've got to keep her and hold her a real girl." "Oh yes, we'll hang on to her hard and keep her real, and Pat too, though we don't need to be afraid he'll vanish if he and Jim do build that house with their own hands, as they're planning over near our meadows. Jim says it'll teach Pat more than Ali ever taught him, but I don't know. Do you know, Rob?" "That's just Jim's exaggeration," Rob replied sagely. "You see, Jim can't help wishing he'd had more to do with Pat's education all those years, so he underrates Ali. He underrates him a lot, I think. Where have they got to, Margaret and Pat, anyway? They went toward our wall, didn't they?" "I didn't notice. Pat's looking for the keep out. This means U sign. I thought it was somewhere over there," she pointed. "I hated it the most of all." "Let's go to Wingate then," Rob suggested. "I'd like to see how much they've mussed up the drawing room. Too bad we can't get in and change everything back, just as it always was." As they drew near the house, they felt the old charm. "Mystery is still here," Claire whispered with relief. "It's all around the place. It's following through the house and into the woods, and from the woods into the house. I don't believe the Tituses ever drove it away. It was stronger than they were." They went in careful silence along the terrace and up to the drawing-room windows. There they stood, shoulder to shoulder, their palms curled against their cheeks, shading their eyes. To their amazed delight, the room was the same room. It was as though nothing at all had happened there to change it. But who had thought to leave everything in its accustomed place? Why, even the little chunky green book lay open on the footstool, as the dead girl had last put it down, and the dead girl's knitting was there in the same corner of the same chair. Only Ali, son of Yusuf, could have arranged things like that in their old order. Claire and Rob knew certainly that it could have been no one but Ali, and suddenly the knowledge came to them that Ali, the Mussulman, must be one of those. He belonged to that precious band of which Granny was the first. "Then we'll see him again sometime," Claire whispered, as though they had spoken their thought of Ali to each other, which they had not. "We'll travel with Pat and Margaret to India and see him again some day. Jim and Rosanna will just have to get over their prejudice. Hester's over hers already, and she will help us with Jim and Rosanna. I think we'd better all go to India together, on Jim's and Rosanna's honeymoon." The gilt mirror reflected its 3 brown tree trunks, green leaves, and the dark boy and girl with a background of July poppies, burning in the still air. Their hearts were peaceful now, content. For after all, in spite of all the alarums and excursions of the last few days, this place was left to them intact. And Then it happened, the most wonderful and mysterious moment of these adventures. A stir far back in the mirror caught their eyes. Two figures were moving forward, there from the crystal depths. Another boy and girl came walking through the sunlight and the burning poppies. Margaret and Pat were drawing near to Claire and Rob, in the clear world of their imagination, while the four stayed lingering together on the terrace by the drawing-room windows. Claire noticed that the face of the little boy Angel must have been dusted, for she could discern his smile.